Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, Chris Finch gave an interview at the end of last week and talked a lot about the Wolves rotation, what Finch says about the end of the rotation, plus some thoughts on individual players that could crack the rotation, including rookie Gobert, Terrence Shannon Jr., and more. Plus, Media Day is today. It's all upcoming next.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to us by our friends at FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. Head to FanDuel.com to get started. Happy Monday, everybody, and happy Media Day. Training camp starts tomorrow. It's happening. It's this week. Preseason starts next week, and there's a lot to get to. Today, I'm going to jump into the Chris Finch interview with Britt Robson at Mid Post. Of course, Britt does a fantastic job covering the Wolves, and this annual interview with Chris Finch is really insightful. Chris Finch is very candid, and there were a number of things Chris Finch said in this 4-part series that Robson did with him last week that validate some of the things we've been talking about on Locked On Wolves this summer regarding the end of the rotation, roles for Jaden McDaniels, for Terrence Shannon Jr., possibly even rookie big man Gobert. There's a lot in there that backs up a lot of what I've said on this show. So we're going to hit some of the high points there. We'll talk a couple of roster moves the Wolves made. I'm going to dig in more on that for tomorrow's show to talk about who these guys are, what roles they could play. The Wolves, remember, do have a couple of actual standard contract roster spots open. So some intrigue there. Could somebody get signed to an actual deal coming out of training camp, or will these guys all end up in Iowa in the G League? So a lot to get to today. A big thank you off the top for making this show your first listen. And of course, you can listen anywhere. You can watch on YouTube, and you can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. All right. So this interview, Britt Robson and Chris Finch, it was, I think, Thursday through Sunday or Wednesday through Saturday is when the parts were released on Mid Post. So please go read it. Go, give Britt those views, those reads, those clicks. It's a really fantastic interview. And I wanted to hit on some of those high points, like I mentioned. And one of the things I talked about on Friday from part one was the discussion about how the Timberwolves backfill the Nickeil Alexander-Walker role. I've talked about that pretty extensively this summer, and I'm just going to hit this quick because I have talked about it a lot. But Chris Finch confirmed that it's rebuilding that role in the aggregate. And what I referenced this maybe the first time I talked about it, but I think of like the scene from the movie Moneyball, right, where they talk about, hey, how do we replace? I think it's Jason Giambi, and they say, well, we're not going to replace Jason Giambi directly with one player. That's not how this works. That's why he's left, because he's too expensive. We need to recreate his production in the aggregate with other players. We need to find other guys who could do what he does and fill that role. Now, Nickeil Alexander-Walker is not Jason Giambi, and I promise you were to come to this podcast today to expect a late 90s, early 2000s MLB star comparison to an NBA role player. They're not the same guy, right? But how do you recreate? I mean, Nickeil was a very important player. He was a very important piece. And it's funny. I think right now, Alexander Walker is living in this world of like the reason why people think the Wolves are going to be worse this year is because they lost to Alexander Walker. And I've talked about this as well. Of course, the FanDuel win total, the championship odds are all absurd. Everybody seems to be somehow down on the team that went to the conference finals 2 straight years with the top 5 player who's going to be 24. It doesn't make any sense. The only reason people can point to is, oh, well, they lost to Alexander Walker. And at the same time, it's one of the reasons why the Hawks have had a top 3 offseason along with Houston and Denver, because they signed Nickeil Alexander Walker. Nickeil's great. Nickeil's awesome. But he's not like worth 5 wins or something for this team. Like, they're not going to be demonstrably worse because they lost Nickeil Alexander Walker. At the same time, we can't downplay what he brought to the team. When you have a guy that's that important to your rotation for the last couple of years and is a big reason why you've gone to 2 straight conference finals, how do you backfill it? How do you backfill those minutes? I think he was 7th on the team in minutes last year. But of course, you've got a former 6th man of the year, Naz Reid. You've got a guy who averaged 16 points as a starter with the Knicks 2 years ago. Like, you've got guys in the bench that can produce. So the Nickeil role, how do you recreate the defense, the 3-point shooting, and the quote unquote backup point guard stuff in the aggregate. And actually there was a quote, and we'll talk, Finch did get into this a little in a later piece of the interview as well, but he calls Nickeil Alexander-Walker a push guard, which is a really, I mean, that's just another way of, he's not a point guard, right? He's not running a high volume of pick and rolls. He's not orchestrating the offense, but he was great at getting the ball, getting the rebound gets ripped down, kicked it to Nickeil. Nickeil would push the pace and push the ball up the floor to somebody else to get into the offense. That was what Nickeil's role was. He was the quote unquote backup point guard out of necessity, but he was ultimately, as Finch called him, a push guard. So how do you recreate that role? How do you recreate the point of attack defense and the 3-point shooting ability? Well, it's the combination of guys that we've talked about. It's Terrence Shannon Jr. And Finch talked about him quite a bit as well in this interview. It's Jalen Clark and it's Rob Dillingham. Those are the three guys that are the obvious replacements. And Rob gives you the offensive piece, and has a much higher ceiling offensively than Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and he's certainly a better shooter off the dribble than Nickeil, even if the catch and shoot numbers at the NBA level haven't been to where Nickeil was as a 3-point shooter. Jalen Clark gives you the point of attack defense. TJ Shannon, in theory, gives you both. He's your best option as a two-way guy, and we might as well talk about TJ now. There was a comment in the last part of the series between Finch and Britt Robson where I'll read the direct quote. He says that Shannon is, quote, solidly in the rotation. And he says, quote, I don't think there's any debate about that. And of course, I don't think anybody thought there was, but to hear the head coach say it on essentially the eve of training camp is a really validating thing, obviously, right? So if TJ's in that 8th spot in the rotation, he's got the best chance of duplicating what Naw did on both ends of the floor. And there's your two-way guy, by the way. Like, TJ Shannon has a higher ceiling than what Nickeil does at this stage in his career, obviously. He can do more as a two-way guy, potentially. He can do more off the dribble. He can do more as a creator. And there's even a comparison, I think it is in part 4, where Finch does say, look, Shannon has some of that the same point guard aspects or qualities as what Nickeil did, as somebody who pushes the pace, makes that initial read correctly. Like, where does this first pass go? He's going to probably have more of an inclination of attacking off the dribble, as we've seen him do in the open floor, both in the regular season and in his brief rotation stint in the playoffs last year against OKC, even more so than Nickeil. And I think he's got the ability and the athleticism to do that and to be a scorer. He was a high-level scorer at the collegiate level. And so there's a lot of upside there for TJ Shannon. And for Finch to say he believes that there's some of that same, again, as he calls Nickeil, a push guard type skill set for TJ Shannon, I mean, that further underscores why he's the 8th guy. Because if he's got that skill set, and then your 9th guy becomes, and we'll get into this more here in a second, more of a rotation based on matchups and other factors. And in fact, we'll do that next year because Finch does concede all of that, where he says something I've been saying on this show for a while, where it's a mix and match situation. It's going to depend on who the opponent is and, who you're playing against, the matchups, and also the quote unquote hot hand, how your guys are playing. So we'll get into that and what Finch's comments on that are. We'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at 5 Hour Energy. Caffeine just got a flavor upgrade. 5 Hour Energy shots deliver tasty caffeine in 17 bold flavors. Each 2-ounce shot packs the caffeine of a premium 12-ounce cup of coffee, plus B vitamins and nutrients with 0 sugar and 0 crashes. What I love most about 5 Hour Energy is just how portable they are. Big taste in a tiny shot. You can take them anywhere, just put them in your pockets, whatever. And you get the boost whenever you need it. I mentioned there's 17 flavors. There's a ton of delicious ones that you can find. And also, in addition to all the different flavors and how portable they are, I love the no sugar crash thing. They kick in quick. And because they're sugar-free, you don't have to worry about how you're going to feel later on. And that's a big thing for me. If I'm taking anything that's going to hopefully give me energy, 5 Hour Energy is the best solution for those reasons. Enough with boring, flavorless caffeine. It is time to give your caffeine a flavor upgrade with 5 Hour Energy shots. Get the favorites you love or be bold and try something new in store and online at www.5hourenergy.com or Amazon today. Again, www.5hourenergy.com or Amazon today. Okay. So Chris Finch thoughts on the rotation. And this was covered in maybe 3 of the 4 parts between Britt Robson at minpost.com and Chris Finch. At one point, he asked him, I think it was like part 2 where they got a bit more into kind of the players, and then part 3, he asks him, he says, you said you were going to expand the rotation. They'd already talked about Shannon and Dillingham. Clark had a good year last year. Finch agreed. And then Robson says, how do you finesse it? You're not going to play 11 guys, are you? And Finch says, no, I doubt it. So then he asks him, will you play 9 with a toggle, or will you play 10? Finch says, quote, I'd like to play 10, but that will be difficult because when you have Rudy, Naz, and Julius soaking up 36 minutes and they're a large part of your identity, those players and the way they play, end quote. So Finch says he'd like to play 10. And then later on, actually, the very next question, he says, it is certainly 9 for sure and a situational 10. Maybe even the 9th guy is different. This is Finch talking. Some nights it might be more of a point guard need. Another might be a defensive need. It could be more of a big on another night, end quote. This is exactly what I've been saying all summer. There's 8 guys, your regular 5 starters, and at some point, sure, Dante DiVincenzo could start instead of Conley. That's possible. So your starters plus Dante, and then your 6th man of the year, Naz Reid. That's 7. TJ Shannon has already been named by Chris Finch as the 8th guy. So the 3 guys we've been talking about all offseason, Jalen Clark, I guess TJ Shannon's one of them. So that leaves Jalen Clark and Rob Dillingham. And then the next guy who gets talked about a little bit later, I think it's part 4, is Jean Beringer, as somebody who also could get some rotation minutes. So if it's 10 guys, that's your 10. Unless it's Joe Ingles, who comes up at the very end of the last part. Like, I guess it's possible, depending on the night. If you want a bigger ball handler, if you need a creator or whatever, it's possible. But your 8 is Shannon, which your 9, that means it's Jalen Clark. Or it's Rob Dillingham. So if it's more of a defensive need, it's Jalen Clark. If it's more of a point guard need, it's Rob Dillingham. Or Joe Ingles, depending on the matchup. If it's more of a big, this isn't where he mentions Beringer, but if you need a big, that's where you're looking. Like, he's the next guy up there. I think that's a really, again, this falls into the category of not surprising, but significant observation by Chris Finch, or candidness by Chris Finch, really, is knowing or being open enough to say, like, look, it's going to depend on all of the above, how we handle that last rotation spot. And there's also, by the way, as long as we're talking about Beringer, there's also some conversation about, like, does he spend time in the G League versus being with the big club in Minneapolis. And he says he, quote, largely wants him to be in Minnesota. They want him to get exposure to Rudy Gobert in practice, in the film room, and, on a daily basis, really. And, make sure that they can kind of cultivate him instead of, obviously, team controls the G League at this point in time. Didn't used to be the case, 15 years ago or whatever, where it was basically a different entity, but the Wolves can do, it's their system in Des Moines. But there's still benefit to having Beringer with the big club. So he's mostly going to be with the Timberwolves is the goal. And then he says they need to be intentional about finding him minutes. So he's going to find some minutes here and there. And again, if you have a defensive need, if you have a big need, that's that last rotation spot. So there is some benefit to having, like, yeah, there's a top 7 and call it 8 with Shannon locked in. But what does it look like? 9, 10. You have all these guys that are going to be competing for those minutes. And that wasn't the case last year. Finch decided early on, we have an 8-man rotation. And there was occasional flashes of 9 with Minot, with Ingles early in the season, and later in the season with Shannon, with Jalen Clark. But it wasn't consistent. And now there's going to be 9 with an occasional 10. And that's an exciting thing, honestly, from a fan standpoint to pay attention to, is there's going to be some movement at the end of the roster. You're going to see these young guys get a chance to play and compete for spots, and it's good compete for minutes. And it's going to be that much more important when inevitably there's some injuries. And you need the guys like Dillingham and Shannon, who have shown what they can do at the end of the rotation, to get opportunities to step in and play heavier minutes as needed. The Beringer piece, I think, is pretty fascinating, and it's good to hear them be open to it. And I think there was an assumption when he was drafted, like, hey, he's a teenager, he's only been playing basketball for 4 years, and Chris Finch doesn't play young guys, and they've got all these bigs already, so there's no chance he plays meaningful minutes. it's refreshing to hear Chris Finch be more than open to the idea of him playing actual rotation minutes, not significant minutes and not every night and not in the top 9 regularly, but in that 10th or 11th spot, depending on matchups, they're going to be open to putting him out there. They even, Finch even says, there's a professionalism and a maturity to him. Not words you usually hear about a teenager that's been playing basketball for less than, what a college career used to be. Like he's been playing since he's played for like 4 to 5 years. Or I guess less than a college career can be now. Got guys that have played in college for 8 years now with all the transfer stuff and COVID years and all that. But I think it's encouraging to hear that the Wolves are open to playing Beranger, but also that they obviously aren't relying on him. This is, I think, fascinating because there is an upside now to what this team could be if some of these guys hit. Is there some uncertainty at the end of the rotation? Yeah. And that's why you have, the Wolves still have an open roster spot. They've got, of course, different windows, buyout market, trade market, et cetera. They could always pull what they did a couple years ago and they traded for Monte Morris. Like there are options to upgrade the roster if it turns out these young guys aren't ready. But that's early in the season is when you try and figure out if these guys are ready. I think the TJ thing is really fascinating. A couple more, the TJ thing and the Beranger thing. A couple more quick things. While we're talking about playmaking, the Jaden McDaniels discussion is interesting. It's something that I talked about a little bit on Friday's show, because it was in part 1 where he talked about McDaniels playmaking a bit potentially. It came up again in part 2 as basically almost like a Julius Randle type push the pace. Finch mentions the possibility of McDaniels playing more at the 4 to allow some of these other guys in the rotation. And that, this is me talking now, is clearly a function of there only are 3 bigs that they trust in the rotation because Beranger is number 4 and he's 19. So they may play smaller at times simply out of necessity, but then also McDaniel slides to the 4, and then that lets you get like KJ at the 3 and then Ant at the 2. Maybe Dillingham gets on the floor, and if Rudy's at the 5, you can get away with that from a defensive rim protection standpoint. If McDaniel's at the 4 and Rudy's at the 5, that's not a bad defensive lineup, and you can get away with Rob at the 1 or whatever, right? So McDaniel's both playmaking more, McDaniel's also playing at the 4. This is setting up to be a big Jaden McDaniels year, and we've seen him improve year after year after year, and there was real improvement last year. And I know I've talked a lot about it this summer. That's encouraging. And it's pretty telling that the Wolves are going to give him, significant opportunity this year to grow in those ways, whether it be as playing more at the 4, which he did early in his career, and also more playmaking out of necessity and watch what Julius Randle does and play like Julius Randle does offensively in a lot of ways. I think that's a good thing for Jaden. I think there's a lot of good about what Julius Randle does offensively, and Jaden has some of the, I know he's got a different frame. That doesn't mean the playing style is dramatically different offensively, or what the Wolves need out of him should be dramatically different offensively. Last couple things. I thought part 2 had some interesting stuff about finishing at the rim. And this is more something that I would talk about on this show. And perhaps I'll dig a bit more into these numbers, but there's a whole kind of back and forth between Britt and Finch about how the Timberwolves just were bad at finishing at the rim last year. And this is an interesting nugget because Finch acknowledges they actually went to the player development level and said, let's retool our finishing program at the player development level with that staff and just get better at finishing at the rim. One of the things he points out when Britt pushes him a little bit more is the you got to hit first thing. And we've talked about this related to Ant, but it's interesting how much it's permeated the whole rosters. Ant is so athletic. This is a point I've made in the past. Ant is so athletic, he can avoid almost any contact and spin it up on the rim. And, occasionally he's dunking on guys. And like that sometimes is to his detriment for 2 reasons. One, because he's not getting foul calls because there's these glancing blows. And because he's so big and strong, it's the Shaq effect that I've talked about before. He doesn't get the benefit of the call because it doesn't look like as much of a foul as it actually is. Like think about the dunk over OKC 2 years ago, the famous marginal contact thing where the SGA's wrapped his hand around Ant's forearm as he's dunking, but he's bouncing off of Ant because Ant is a physical specimen and he's so athletic and explosive and powerful. It doesn't look like a foul. And then the second piece of that is by contorting your body and doing all this stuff, you're less likely to make the shot at the rim anyway. So you're not getting the foul call and you're missing the layup. And Ant's not the only one. Like I said, it's kind of permeated the rest of the team. Dante's a good example. Nas didn't finish well at the rim. And I think part of it is the process, like knowing having a plan before you get to the rim, but then the read and react of, I got to hit first. I got to create this contact. And as much as that seems counterintuitive, we hear it all the time. You hear all the time in NBA broadcasts, creating the contact, and you usually get the foul call by doing that. And again, because Ant is so physical and explosive and powerful, he can finish through contact and score. He just usually avoids it. And then he doesn't get the foul call, and he makes a tougher shot for him, or makes the shot for himself become a tougher shot. It turns into a tougher shot because he's avoiding the contact. I think that was a really fascinating point. And the numbers at the rim were down a lot. Part of that is also, it's certainly mostly technique, but there's probably some variance there too. And that's another reason I think this offense could continue to get better, is they created a lot of shots at the rim. They were there. They just missed too many. And you think you make another shot a game at the rim, if that improves by a half a percentage point or a percentage point over the course of the year, that's going to boost this offense in a big way. All right, I want to hit a couple more thoughts here. We'll talk briefly about the roster and the plan for the week as we also put a bow on this interview. Oh, also one more thought on the ESPN NBA player rank. So we'll do all that here next to close out the show. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at FanDuel. The NFL season is here, and FanDuel has an offer that you do not want to miss. We are into week 4. Week 4 just ended. What day of the week is it? Week 4 is, or it's ending tonight. Monday Night Football tonight. There's actually 2 games tonight. Get excited. Lots of fun action to get involved in on FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet just $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win. That's right. Pick a bet, put down $5, and if it hits, you'll unlock $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. There are 2 games tonight. And I love 2-game nights because they're kind of staggered. So you can go multi-view, you can go a couple of boxes, you go 2 TVs, whatever it is. But you could look at Jets, Dolphins. Miami's favored by 2.5 at home. They're interesting games. Like, that's a weird one. A little bit of a, neither one of these teams could really afford to lose. I don't love that game at all. Bengals at Broncos. Bengals are underdogs. They're plus 7.5 points on the road. Of course, backup quarterback there. Crazy, like really interesting games. This feels like one, maybe you just pick one and you go same game parlays, or you bounce back and forth and you kind of live bet the games. Of course, you can live bet on FanDuel as well. I'd be worried about those spreads. So maybe it's a perfect live bet game. It feels like you just kind of watch the game, see what's happening, have fun live betting it within the FanDuel app. What are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com to download the FanDuel app today and get started. All right, so putting a bow on the Brit interview with Chris Finch, I thought the most interesting takeaways were the TJ Shannon bit, like he's solidly in the rotation, the acknowledgement of the 9th, ideally 9 and 10 both spot. He liked to play 9 with a usual 10th and not a regular 11th, but knowing that the 9th and 10th roles. He says the 10th and maybe even the 9th roles could be flexible depending on matchups. I like it because it validates what I've been saying all summer. It's exactly what I've been saying. They don't really know. So it's going to have to depend on matchups more than anything else. I thought it was interesting. They talked a little bit about the Jaden playmaking piece, the Jaden playing the 4 piece, the finish at the rim that we just talked about, the possibility of Barangay getting some rotation minutes. All those things are interesting. The last thing I wanted to talk about is at the end of the 4th part, there was some pretty interesting things, really long answers from Chris Finch about last year wasn't that fun for him. He said, let's see, what was the exact quote? Well, let's see. Britt says, quote, "You had talked toward the end of the year about it not being the most pleasant year for you. Was that just because of the Karl-Anthony Towns trade?" And Finch just said no. And Britt says, "Or was it because it's harder and less fun to sustain than it is to climb?" Finch says, "No doubt about that. This will be a challenge again." And then he goes into a long answer, and I'm not going to read it, but he talks about there wasn't enough internal drive. They talked about the coaching staff kind of got in their heads about some of the numbers and forgetting that these are humans, essentially. He didn't say forgetting. Paraphrasing is dangerous, but he says basically, we have to acknowledge these are humans. It's not just the numbers. He says he was hell-bent on making an 8-man rotation work, and he said he learned some lessons. It was hard. It was less fun. And then he talked about, he brought up the word moodiness. He said, "We had a moodiness about us, which was not always a pleasant place to come to work every day. Moodiness is a hard one because if you are real moody, then you are worried more about the inside than the outside. We've got to get beyond that. And then Britt says, he acknowledges ownership is settled. We know Tim Conley's here for at least 2 years. Randle and Rudy got their contracts. There's no excuse for moodiness. Finch says the moodiness is just being worried too much about yourself. And then he goes on to talk about ownership's been fine even throughout the transition, that, didn't affect them in the locker room on the court. Conley's great. And then he goes on to talk about it's pretty interesting. I don't want to read between the lines too much. I think this is a kind of an Ant thing. And by the way, part 3 was all about Anthony Edwards, a really good read. So go read that. But he says, last year, he says, quote, it was continuing to grow up. You think somebody's been in the league 4, 5, 6, 7 years, whatever. Of course, they're maturing as a player, but the person is still at a young age. They're going through the cycle of challenges that life presents itself, whether it's professional or personal. You feel this pressure to get the big contract. When you get it, you feel pressure to justify it. It's another level of the same pressure. You have a young family. You have all this stuff going on. It's largely why young teams don't win at the highest level, but we have to be beyond that this year. End quote. So I want to be clear. I think he's talking about more guys than just Ant, but Ant's the most obvious person to look at. You can look at Julius Randle. There was a great piece that John Krasinski of The Athletic put out late last week or over the weekend about Julius Randle and the challenges of his getting traded to Minnesota when he did and living out of boxes in an apartment. And they finally have a house now and some stability in Minneapolis. And you could look at Rudy. Rudy had some personal stuff off the floor, and Rudy finally got paid before last year. I should say finally, but he got his contract situation. The extension worked out. You could look at any of those guys. And obviously Rudy's the most veteran, and then Julius, and then Ant. But those guys all kind of fit the description of what Finch is saying. And it doesn't mean those challenges are gone. Those challenges are still there. It's just now you've got a year with them under your belt. You're a year further removed from the trade if you're Julius Randle. You're, another conference finals year for everybody and an understanding of what needs to be done this year. So all that to say, go check out the interview. It's fantastic. There's a lot of stuff that obviously I'm not just going to read for the show. So go check it out over at MinPost. And again, Britt does a great job there, and Finch does an awesome job being candid with his answers. Last couple things I wanted to hit very quickly. Of course, media day is today. The Timberwolves made a couple of signings over the weekend. We talked on Friday about a couple of guys the Wolves signed and then waived. They signed and waived Nate Santos. They signed and waived CJ Fulton. Those are guys who they signed to get on Exhibit 10 deals, essentially get their rights to be in the G League. And then they get waived. So they're not actually training camp guys, but they can go to the G League and get a bonus if they stay for 30 plus days. And actually the Santos waiving happened after I recorded Friday's show. So both of those guys not on the training camp roster. Guys who will be, that we'll dig into more on tomorrow's show. So you guys, listeners for this show can have a bit more of a profile of who they are. Alize Johnson, who has not played in the NBA in a couple of years, like 3 years actually, was signed to a deal. I would assume a non-guaranteed deal. May or may not be Exhibit 10, but I would assume he's in training camp since he hasn't been waived yet. The Wolves also signed Jules Bernard and Zion Pullen. Bernard played for the Wizards a couple of years ago, was in the G League last year and scored a ton. We'll talk more about him tomorrow as well. And then Pullen played briefly for the Grizzlies at the end of the year last year after having a really good season in the G League. So a couple of high-level scorers in the G League with limited NBA experience for those two, and then Johnson as well. So we'll talk about all three of those guys tomorrow, and I'll kind of dive into why I think they signed them, what they're going to provide, and could any of them get a regular roster spot? Because Minnesota does still have 2 spots available. I would imagine they'll fill one, they have 1 spot available because they did sign Bones Highland, although that was still a partial guarantee. So always possible they let him go and sign 2 guys. I think it's more likely they don't sign anybody, but could any of them have an inside track on that open spot, or are they all simply training camp fodder and likely or possible to go to the G League with the Iowa Wolves this year? We'll dig into that on tomorrow's show. And then my last thing for today is the NBA rank, the player rank at ESPN, which I spent a lot of time talking about last week. And yes, it was an inferior list to our Locked On NBA top 100 player list. There was a discussion that Tim Bontemps of ESPN had with scouts, coaches, and executives about the top 100 for feedback. He asked if the top 5 was right, and everybody said the same top 5 in some order: Jokic, SGA, Giannis, Luka. Obviously, my ranking was in order: Jokic, SGA, Luka, Giannis. And then he said lots of guys got votes for 5th, including Wembanyama, Curry, Ant, Durant, and Mitchell. I think the only ones you can honestly argue for number 5 would be Ant and Steph Curry. I had Ant 5, Curry 6. The Locked On list had Curry 5, Ant 6. the ESPN list had Wemby at 5, which is nuts. Because like we got to see it here, right? We're 2 years in, no full seasons in, and a team that hasn't won. I mean, I could be in 6 months. He could be a top 5 player. That's certainly possible, but I think we got to see it first. Donovan Mitchell's interesting. Mitchell's like, what was he, like 11 or 13 or something on the ESPN list? We had him in the top 10 on the Locked On list, and I had him in the top 10 on my list. So somebody thought Donovan Mitchell should be top 5, and I like the argument. Durant at 5 now seems pretty, I don't know, optimistic for what Kevin Durant is at this stage in his career. He's still a great scorer, but having him as a top 5 player seems kind of crazy. So anyway, I thought that was interesting. Not a whole lot else Ant related. A lot of Cooper Flagg talk about how high he could be in a year. Interesting. But anyway, that's over at ESPN. All right. Media days today. Enjoy all the media day content that's going to be out there. I'll talk about anything notable, quote wise, or anything that comes out today during the event on tomorrow's show. And then we will also talk about the 3 new additions to the Timberwolves roster on tomorrow's show. So that's what we'll do tomorrow. And moving forward, we'll get into some player previews as we look ahead to preseason next week. And of course, any training camp content as well that comes out throughout the week. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And a reminder, the Locked On NBA Top 100 is still available over at Locked On Sports Today. If you missed it, I talked about it a couple of weeks ago on the show. Basically every show in the week. It's a great list. It's better than ESPN's. Go check it out when you get a moment. Of course, this Locked On Wolves podcast is part of that very same Locked On Podcast Network, your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.